Hi, my name is Kate Chandler. My talk today is entitled Apartheid Drone, Infrastructures of Militarism and Hidden Genealogies of the South African Seeker. I would like to thank the organizers for their work producing technologies of power, tracing empire at home and abroad, as well as my fellow panelists in the session devoted to Warscape's Geographies of Violence, and the funding provided by the Dean of the Humanities War and Peace Initiative grant at Columbia University. Today, I will share with you research from an article in progress on the South African Seeker drone, a surveillance platform and weapon developed under apartheid with support from Israel in the late 1970s and early 1980s. As Sasha Polakowsaransky explains, during the period, Israel profited handsomely from arms exports, and South Africa gained access to cutting-edge weaponry at a time when the rest of the world was turning against the apartheid state. The Seeker was used in Operation Protea in present-day Angola in 1981, a year before the deployment of the Scout aircraft in Bekaa Valley in 1982, typically cited as the inaugural use of modern drone technologies. The U.S. military drone program also draws from these technologies, purchasing the Pioneer from Israel in 1985. To be clear, the weapons that I am referring to were armed with cameras in the 1980s and differ from current technologies used by the United States and Israel that integrate a missile with the unmanned platform. Unmanned aircraft in the 1980s relied on radio rather than satellite link and could be only flown for relatively short distances, up to 50 miles, from the control station. This meant that the aircraft were particularly suitable for border conflicts like the Lebanon War in the 1980s or the South African border wars, and were primarily used for surveillance and to attract anti-aircraft fire. At the same time, all three countries carried out experiments with these aircraft that would turn them into attack platforms. During Truth and Reconciliation, the South African Air Force was accused of using the Seeker armed with chemical weapons in Mozambique, although a UN investigation into the matter was inconclusive. I bring forward this shared genealogy to work through how aerial optics of the drone, the racial privileges advanced by apartheid, and the ideology of technological advance are interconnected within the Seeker, and how these associations traffic between neo-colonial wars in the 1980s and the US-led War on Terror beginning in 2001. I also want to take stock of how South Africa's role as a leader in the development of the drone aircraft has largely been erased and replaced with a narrative from the global north, exemplified by a 2017 headline in the New York Times, "High above, drones keep watchful eyes on Africa," that deploys drone aircraft in Africa writ large to protect endangered species. The intervention of this work is to complement the theories of feminist and postcolonial scholars who study targeting and its normalization in everyday life. Karen Kaplan observes how GPS during the first Gulf War served as an advertisement for now ubiquitous mapping technologies. Ray Chow underlines how the Age of the World target led to the creation of area studies in the United States during the Cold War, which serve as the organizing logic for many university programs, including the School of Foreign Service, where I teach. While Samuel Weber notes that both diversity hires and the capture of Saddam Hussein are described as targets of opportunity. Targeting, as in Sheila Mbembe observes in Necropolitics, divides the world into above and below, while ideas of progress, advance, and development attempt to undo and naturalize the violence of this hierarchy. In the case of the South African Seeker, however, I attend not only to how the enemy is framed by the platform, succinctly described by Derek Gregory as a view to a kill, but the counterpart of this view. The drone also establishes a field of protection and privilege for a particular subset of people, a version of the normalization of war that Foucault describes in Society Must Be Defended. In the case of apartheid South Africa, unmanned aircraft are aligned with white supremacy, while the logic of technological advance normalizes a racialized divide that separates above from below. The drone figures as a society under attack that must be defended, even though the drone is an unmanned decoy, a surveillance camera, and secret weapon. In online forums devoted to the South African Air Force during apartheid, commentators often emphasize the invisible superiority proposed by unmanning and the humor that their technology is perceived to be man. A commentator writes, "It was amusing to read that when one drone was shot down, the enemy spent 3 days looking for the pilot. It is also amazing how far ahead in technology we were in those days." Another recalls, in 1983, an unmanned aerial vehicle was lost over Mozambique after it was shot down by a Soviet SA-3 missile, after quite a few Soviet SA-3 missiles had been fired at it. Well, it was busy doing post-strike damage assessment on a raid by an Impala light strike aircraft as a reprisal for the Church Street bombing in Pretoria. A corollary to this invisible sphere of protection can be found in accounts of US soldiers who describe drone aircraft as guardian angels, or the recent deployment of United States drones to watch Black Lives Matter protests in Minneapolis, or the policing of migration along the border of Mexico, which aligned the aircraft with an invisible white population that must be protected. The overlay of wartime protection, border controls, and policing is also apparent in the uses that are proposed for the seeker following the end of apartheid. For a brief period, in the 1990s, the state-controlled Armaments Corporation, which secretly acquired the drone from Israel in the previous decade, aimed to rebrand the drone as a tool for democratic protections. The company reveals the secret existence of the drone in 1995. A company report explains the seeker remotely piloted aircraft developed some years ago was successfully deployed during the 1994 elections to monitor unrest areas. The South African Army is also using the system to monitor attempts to cross the national borders illegally. Here, the divisions between above and below are replaced by national policing and border protection, even as it is clear these new uses build on the privileges of a particular protected population. By the 2000s, however, South Africa's unmanned aircraft had become a footnote in the emerging use of drone aircraft for targeted killing by Israel and the United States beginning in 2000. For nearly a decade, these strikes are not explicitly acknowledged by the United States government and instead are a, quote, secret weapon. Yet if one looks closely, one can still find traces of the South African seeker, notably in a 2003 article in the Wall Street Journal, "Drones outfitted for combat are the next on defense firms' radar," which describes the South African seeker as having already transitioned to non-military purposes, noting among its uses locating poachers in game reserves. By the mid-2010s, the global north will return to the idea of drone aircraft for wildlife conservation, now as an ostensibly good use of the technology that was developed for the war on terror. Their history as an apartheid weapon is largely erased. The wartime uses of the seeker against African revolutionary forces in multiple countries becomes a benevolent protection for endangered species. Notably, these uses for drone aircraft have substantial limitations and questions remain about their effectiveness for anti-poaching, especially given that they do not address the root causes, which include demand for rhinoceros horn in Asia and social, political, and economic inequities in Southern Africa. At the present moment, drone aircraft are widely imagined as a tool for militaries and police, as well as for commercial delivery, humanitarian aid, wildlife management, and journalism. In reckoning with these new uses, it is important to dissect how logics of technological advance and democratic protections are entangled with racial hierarchies and military divisions. Drone aircraft will continue to reproduce the divides of targeting and protection unless these patterns are explicitly refashioned through attention to the unequal relationships made by the drone. This work calls for careful attention to the populations that drone target, found, for example, in the scholarship of Madiha Tahir and Ivan Char Lopez, as well as making visible how secrecy, nation, and environment are used to normalize hierarchies that the drone instantiates both in wartime violence and increasingly in daily life.